Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a stack of sources that plunges us really into the core anxiety of the ancient world, this belief that excessive wealth, that luxury, it's somehow corrosive, that it threatens to just dismantle the moral foundation of the state.
Yeah, absolutely. It's this fascinating attempt, really, to legislate virtue itself. When we talk about ancient law, a lot of people probably think immediately of those famous Roman sumptuary laws.
Right, the dinner party spending caps or how much jewelry a woman could wear.
Exactly,
Yeah.
stuff like that. But this deep dive, well, we're aiming to go much further. We're looking at the broader, maybe deeper legal and social mechanisms, things used in both the
Yeah.
Greek and Roman worlds to control, to define, and, constrain elite status, public display.
And private spending too, but maybe not by counting grapes.
Right, more through institutional power, legal structures, rather than, measuring spices on a scale or something.
And that really is the central tension we need to unpack for you, isn't it? How did these ancient states, especially places like Rome and Athens, so competitive, so status conscious, how did they manage to balance this expectation of, let's say, personal liberty, the idea that, hey, if you earned it, you should be able to spend it, with this really fierce drive to preserve what they saw as their traditional virtues, their social order, especially when huge, totally destabilizing amounts of new wealth started pouring in.
It wasn't just like simple envy. It felt existential to them.
Yeah.
And this cultural battle against excess, it found its strongest voice, arguably, in philosophy.
Oh, okay.
Now, if you look at thinkers like Cicero, the fundamental argument is always that reason.
Yeah.
Reason has to be the absolute governor of appetite. That's how you maintain composure, moderation.
She'll control your desires.
Exactly. The minute people let their appetites run wild, chasing luxury for luxury's sake, piling up wealth just to flaunt it. Ciceroans, they become insufficiently restrained by reason. They cross, as he puts it, every boundary and due limit.
So that instantly flips wealth, doesn't it? It's not just an economic thing anymore. It becomes a profound moral test. If your inner stability, your ability to reason, depends on controlling those desires for excess, well, then luxury is fundamentally destabilizing.
Absolutely spot on. And Cicero frames it so well when he talks about virtue. He says, look, justice is the quality people admire most. Okay. But then he argues, nobody can truly be just if they're terrified of poverty or pain, or crucially, if they prefer piling up money over basic equity. The person who shows a spirit that's like unmoved by the temptation of money, that's the person who gets the greatest admiration. It really suggests that how you handle wealth, how you display it, that's the crucible where true civic virtue is either, melted down or forged stronger.
But the state, well, it found itself fighting this battle more on the streets than in philosophical seminars, right? Society didn't always listen to Cicero's high-minded ideals.
Oh, definitely not. You see, the real messy cultural struggle perfectly captured in, say, Juvenal's Rome. His satires just mocked the sheer absurdity of the new money elite, these guys who came from nothing and were suddenly challenging the old guard.
Yeah, the established families.
Exactly. Juvenal often targets the freedman, the ex-slave, who, through business or maybe imperial favor, somehow amassed millions, just dwarfing the old, sometimes impoverished patrician families. He talks about this character,
Crispinus, right.
probably Juvenal sneers, Delta bred, so from Egypt, a former house slave. And he rises up to challenge what Juvenal considers good society. And how does he do it? He's decked out in Tyrian purple dye.
Which was insanely expensive.
Unimaginably luxurious, yeah. But even then, Crispinus manages to make a complete mockery of the whole concept of elite display.
And it's that tiny detail Juvenal zeroes in on, that almost pathetic moment of vanity.
The ring, exactly. He wears this thin gold ring in the summer on his sweaty finger, claims his heavier, more spectacular jewels are, resting safely in his jewel box.
Right.
And he makes this grand gesture saying he just couldn't bear to wear his heavier jewels in the summer heat. It's perfect.
Yeah.
That single act just encapsulates the whole societal breakdown.
Because the old elite had rules, customs, maybe even laws trying to police this stuff, limits on purple dye, maybe gold consumption, all rooted in these old Republican virtues. But here comes Crispinus, the symbol of this unchecked new wealth, and he's using the language of old luxury, oh, I'm too refined for heavy jewels, while simultaneously mocking it with this ridiculous, conspicuous display of not wearing his even bigger jewels.
He's showing off by not showing off, essentially, drawing attention to the fact that he owns jewels too heavy to wear casually. It's like Juvenal saying, see, the battle's already lost. these laws, these customs meant to contain luxury. They've just become tools for the new millionaires to signal how much richer they are.
It's a brilliant, cynical observation. So the pretense of aristocratic sensibility becomes the ultimate flex.
Exactly. The whole system's been turned inside out.
Okay, so if that's the Roman anxiety playing out, let's maybe rewind a bit. Where did these kinds of control mechanisms even start? You mentioned the Greeks.
Right. To understand the origins, we really have to look at democratic Athens, because they came up with some truly radical, sometimes, frankly, terrifying ways to control elite power if it seemed to threaten the state itself. And the most famous example, of course, is ostracism.
Ostracism, yeah, that's the big one. The ultimate check, maybe.
You could call it that. It was basically a state-sanctioned method for banishing powerful people, sending them into exile for 10 years.
10 years.
10 years. And the key thing is, it wasn't necessarily because they'd committed a specific crime. It was often just for having too much influence, maybe too much wealth, being too popular.
Wow.
It was like preventative political hygiene, trying to keep the democracy healthy, especially in its early days.
So the danger wasn't just corruption, it was prestige, just being too influential.
Precisely. Too much sway over the people. The mechanics of it are pretty fascinating, too. Once a year, the assembly would vote on whether to even hold an ostracism.
Okay.
If they voted yes, then citizens would grab a piece of broken pottery, an ostracon, and scratch the name of the person they wanted banished onto it.
Literally voting on shards.
Literally.
Yeah.
And then, for an ostracism to actually happen, a minimum of 6,000 votes had to be cast against one specific individual.
6,000 votes. That's a significant number. And when you look at who actually got ostracized, it tells you this wasn't some minor slap on the wrist.
Not at all. The list is basically a who's who of 5th century BC Athens. You've got Aristides, famed for his justice, Themistocles, the hero of the Persian Wars, Salamis.
The guy who saved Athens.
Pretty much. Cimon, the great general. Thucydides, son of Milesius, a major political rival of Pericles. These weren't fringe characters, they were pillars of the state, removed for being, essentially, too successful, too influential.
Even guys from powerful old families were immune.
Nope. People like Megacles and another Alcibiades' grandfathers, the later, much more famous Alcibiades, they were targeted too. It cut across the political spectrum.
But there's one name on that list that seems really counterintuitive, and it hints at maybe a deeper cultural suspicion in Athens. Damon.
Ah, Damon, yes. That's a fascinating case. Damon was Pericles' teacher, his preceptor, specifically in poetry and music. He was an eminent philosopher.
So not a general, not a politician trying to seize power.
Exactly. He seems to have been banished for being too philosophical, maybe, or just too influential in the realm of abstract thought and culture, which, through Pericles, connected to power. It's deeply revealing.
What does it reveal?
Well, some ancient writers point to it as evidence of what they call the vulgar side of humanity, this kind of underlying resentment that finds high culture, philosophy, intellectuals, well, unpopular, especially when those intellectuals are linked to powerful figures like Pericles. It suggests that just standing out too much in any field could be seen as an offense against the democratic ideal of sort of rough equality.
That's a chilling thought, really. Don't get too smart or too cultured.
Or at least don't seem to be leveraging it for influence. But what's also crucial here is how ostracism itself changed over time. It started as this really profound safeguard for the democracy. But it kind of ended up as just another political trick.
How so?
Well, initially, it served its purpose. The very first guy known to be ostracized was Hipparchus. He was a relative of the Pisistratids, the tyrants Athens had just thrown out.
Okay, so that makes sense. Preventing a comeback.
Exactly. That was a clear existential move to stop tyranny returning.
The feeling around that first use must have been incredibly serious. But, as the democracy got more stable, as generations passed, that original deep conviction behind ostracism, it just eroded.
It lost its moral authority.
Precisely. By the time we get to the last known use, maybe 90 years after it started, it had become almost nakedly political theater. The target was a guy named Hyperbolus.
Hyperbolus.
And his ostracism was apparently engineered by two top dogs who were usually bitter rivals, Nicias and Alcibiades. The Alcibiades.
The very same. They supposedly teamed up, realizing that if they didn't, the vote might fall on one of them. So they collaborated to turn the process into a political trick, focusing the votes onto Hyperbolus, who they both saw as weaker.
Wow.
This kind of collusion, this manipulation by the powerful, it basically signaled to everyone that the mechanism was broken. It wasn't a democratic safeguard anymore. It was just a tool for the elites to play games with. It became sort of antiquated, useless after that.
So ostracism was the stick, the big threat to physically remove someone. But Athens also had other ways to manage the elite, right? Particularly their wealth. You mentioned legislating public financial obligations.
Yes, this is where Athens got really clever, or maybe coercive, depending on your view. They essentially mastered the art of making mandatory state spending look like voluntary patriotism.
How did that work?
The state, especially the democracy with its large navy and elaborate public festivals, needed enormous amounts of money. So they relied heavily on things like the liturgies.
Liturgies, what were those?
They were basically public services, but they were financed privately by the wealthiest citizens. Think of it as mandatory sponsorship. And then there was the aisphora, which was a direct tax, usually levied in emergencies, on property or wealth.
But didn't Athenian ideology always bang on about how good citizenship was voluntary? You know, the speeches praising men who chose to give their fortunes to the city?
That was absolutely the ideal, the public face of it, glorifying the volunteer spirit. But the underlying reality, which everyone understood, was that these duties, these liturgies, they were ultimately mandatory orders or obligations. They weren't polite requests.
So the state had officials who assigned these.
Yes, they had to. State agents, like the archon or other magistrates, were responsible for picking who had to perform which liturgy. Why? Because there was definitely resistance. The system was partly designed to combat the artful dodgers, as you might call them.
Give us a sense of the scale. What kind of obligations are we talking about, and how expensive were they?
Yeah. Oh, the costs could be absolutely staggering, potentially crippling for a family fortune. The most famous liturgy was the triarchy.
The trireme one.
That's the one. Financing and commanding a worship, a trireme, for a whole year. That could easily cost a talent of silver, maybe more.
And a talent was a lot.
A huge amount, equivalent to the value of a pretty large estate, or years of wages for hundreds of skilled workers. And you might be assigned this more than once in your lifetime.
Oh, wow. Oh, no.
Other major ones included the Choresia that was funding the training in costumes and staging for the dramatic choruses at the big religious festivals, like the Dionysia. Hugely expensive and intensely competitive because a winning chorus brought immense prestige to its sponsor.
So part obligation, part status symbol.
Very much so. They were also funding embassies, equipping cavalry, things like that. For a wealthy Athenian man, these could pile up significantly over a lifetime.
So how did the wealthy try to get out of it? What were the tricks of the artful dodgers?
Well, the resistance could be quite sophisticated. The main legal dodge was something called the antidosis.
Antidosis.
Yeah. If you were assigned a liturgy you didn't want, you could legally challenge someone else, claiming they were actually wealthier than you and therefore they should do it instead.
Seriously. How did that play out?
It was high stakes. The person you challenged had two options. Either they accepted the liturgy, or they could agree to swap their entire property with you.
Swap everything, their whole estate.
Everything. The idea was, if you genuinely believed they were richer, you should be happy to swap. Of course, most cases probably went to arbitration before it got that far. But it shows the pressure. Other tactics were more straightforward. Maybe leave the city for a while, try to underreport your assets, fudge your property registration to seem less wealthy than you were.
It really highlights the complexity of trying to legislate wealth, doesn't it? The state wasn't just seizing money, it was creating this elaborate system to compel spending, often by leveraging social pressure and competition among the rich themselves.
Exactly. And ensuring the essential services, especially the fleet, got funded. The elite response was, as you'd expect, varied. You probably had some truly cynical evaders, obsessed with protecting their inheritance using every loophole. Then you had the zealous patriots, the ones who embraced the spending, maybe seeing it as an investment in their own political careers and public fame.
Competing for honor by spending the most.
Right. But likely the majority were somewhere in the middle. They were genuinely worried about the threat these huge expenditures posed to their family's long-term financial security. But they also understood the city needed the money, and they definitely feared the public backlash if they looked like they were shirking their duty. Athens' power kind of relied on making sure even the most private, wealthy citizen felt financially exposed and accountable to the state's demands.
Okay, so that's controlling wealth and influence. Let's shift focus slightly to how law controlled private conduct and defined social roles. The Athenian homicide laws seem incredibly detailed, almost obsessive. What do they tell us?
They tell us volumes about Athenian social hierarchy and values. It wasn't, as we might think of it, a single system of criminal justice for murder. It was incredibly specialized. Athenian law meticulously categorized homicide cases, and it linked the specific trial court, and crucially, the penalty, directly to the killer's intent and the status of the victim.
The status of the victim. That's key.
Absolutely fundamental. A life was not just a life. Its value in the eyes of the law depended heavily on who it belonged to.
Okay, let's break down these courts. You mentioned 5 different jurisdictions.
That's right. The most serious, the top tier, was the Areopagus Court. This ancient council handled cases of intentional killing of an Athenian citizen.
Intentional killing, citizen victim, and the penalty.
Mandatory death, no exceptions. This was seen as the gravest possible offense against the polis itself.
Okay. What if the killing was unintentional, like an accident? Or if the victim wasn't a citizen?
Then the case went to a different court, the Palladian. And here's where that status distinction really bites. Killing a non-citizen, even intentionally, was simply not treated with the same severity as intentionally killing a citizen. So at the Palladian, if you unintentionally killed a citizen or if you killed a non-citizen, regardless of intentional or not, the penalty was exile.
Just exile, not death.
Exile. But there was a possibility of pardon if the victim's relatives agreed to allow the killer back. Still, the core point is stark. The life of a non-citizen, even maybe an important resident alien, a medic, it just didn't carry the same legal weight as a full citizen's life.
That's quite explicit. And then you have this really strange category. Lawful killings, tried at the Delphinian court.
Yes, the Delphinian is maybe the most revealing of all because it shows us the specific situations where the state essentially said, okay, in this case, homicide is permissible. It sanctioned killing to uphold certain social norms.
What counted as a lawful killing?
Several things. Killing someone accidentally during an athletic contest, like boxing or pancration, that was considered lawful. Killing a highway robber in legitimate self-defense, also lawful.
Makes sense so far.
But the most famous, and perhaps most shocking to us, was killing a man you caught in the act in flagrante delicto with your wife, or your mother's sister, daughter, or even your concubine, provided she was kept for the specific purpose of procreating free children.
Wow. So catching an adulterer in the act with specific female relatives, you could kill him on the spot and the law might excuse it.
Potentially, yes. You'd plead your case to the Delphinian, arguing it was lawful homicide. It shows how deeply the law prioritized the protection of the male lineage, the purity of the household, and the control over female sexuality.
More than the sanctity of the adulterer's life, it seems.
Absolutely. Adultery wasn't just a private matter. It was seen as a kind of violent assault on the male head of household's property, his honor, and the integrity of his citizen bloodline. The law effectively licensed a citizen to act as an executioner in defense of that bloodline's purity.
And if the jury at the Delphinian didn't buy your plea, if they thought it wasn't really lawful,
then the case would default back into the other categories. If they decided you intended to kill him regardless of the adultery, you could end up at the Areopagus facing death if the victim was a citizen. If it was deemed unintentional or the victim wasn't a citizen, back to the Palladian for exile.
It's incredibly layered. And the law's reach extended even beyond Attic soil, didn't it? What about someone already in exile?
Ah, yes, the Furieto court. This is just an amazing image. If someone was already banished for a previous homicide and then got accused of committing another homicide while in exile.
How would that even work?
They weren't allowed to set foot back in Attica. So the trial took place with the accused pleading their case from a boat moored just offshore the harbor, maybe the Piraeus.
From a boat?
From a boat, addressing the jury who were assembled on the land. It shows the law's determination to follow its subjects, to maintain its jurisdiction, even when they were physically outside the territory.
That's incredible. And what really strikes me is how exhaustive this whole system feels. It wasn't just about humans, was it? They even dealt with non-human killers.
Right, that's the Perennial court. This court handled cases where the killer was an animal or even an inanimate object.
An inanimate object, like a falling rock.
Exactly. If an animal, say an ox, gored someone to death, the animal could be tried at the Prytaneum. If found guilty, it would be executed. If an inanimate object, like that falling beam or a chunk of masonry, caused the death, the object itself was put on trial.
What happened to a guilty object?
It was formally condemned and then ritually exiled, typically thrown over the border into neighboring Boeotia.
They exiled a rock.
They did. Of course, it wasn't about punishing the rock. It was about achieving symbolic closure, restoring ritual purity, and demonstrating the state's absolute claim to regulate all sources of harm within its domain, human or otherwise. It's about assigning responsibility, even symbolically.
If the law was that meticulous about homicide and household purity, it's probably no surprise it was also deeply involved in controlling the lives of women, defining their social sphere. And here, Athens and Sparta seem like polar opposites.
They really are. The contrast tells us so much about the different ways these societies tried to build the ideal citizen, male and female. In Athens, the ideal for a citizen woman was almost entirely defined by seclusion and domesticity.
Kept inside, basically.
Pretty much. Formal education for Athenian girls, almost non-existent, beyond what they needed for household tasks, weaving, managing food supplies, childcare. From puberty until they were married off, they were largely confined to the women's quarters of the house, the gynecolonitis.
And there was that famous idea that a respectable Athenian man wouldn't even want his wife's name mentioned in public by men outside the family.
Exactly. Her virtue was tied to her invisibility or lack of public presence. Athenian citizen women had zero official role in the democracy, couldn't vote, couldn't speak in the assembly, couldn't hold office. And critically, they couldn't own significant property in their own right. They were legal dependents their whole lives.
So if you hear about influential women in Athenian sources,
They're almost always non-citizens. Maybe Aspasia, Pericles' partner, a highly educated woman from Miletus, or famous hetairai, sophisticated courtesans. They operated outside the strict boundaries set for respectable citizen wives and daughters.
but then you look at Sparta, Athens' great rival, and it's a completely different picture for women, isn't it? Though still rigidly controlled by the state.
Oh, absolutely, still controlled, but towards a totally different end. Spartan women and girls experienced far more relative freedom and public visibility than their Athenian counterparts.
How so?
They were included in the state-mandated education system, the agos, at least to some extent. This involved rigorous physical training, gymnastics, running, maybe even wrestling. And they also received education in music, dance, and poetry for the soul, as the sources say.
Why? What was the Spartan thinking behind educating women physically and culturally?
It was pure social engineering, aimed at strengthening the state. Thinkers like Plato, writing about Sparta, even if critically sometimes, connect this emphasis on training women directly to the city's overall strength and cohesion as a community. The Spartan logic was brutally simple. We need strong warriors. Strong warriors come from strong mothers. Therefore, the state must ensure women are physically fit and mentally disciplined to bear and raise the next generation of Spartan soldiers.
So their public active role was legislated by the state for military purposes.
Essentially, yes. Their lives were controlled just as strictly as Athenian women's lives, maybe even more so in some ways. But the purpose of that control was radically different, geared towards public participation in service of the state's military machine, rather than private seclusion.
Okay, so we've seen Athenian democracy using ostracism and financial compulsion, and both Athens and Sparta using law to rigidly define gender roles. Let's swing back to Rome, especially as it becomes an empire. If Athens used ostracism, Rome seems to have leaned more into, well, formalizing differential justice based on rank.
That's a good way to put it. The anxiety about wealth was definitely there in Rome, maybe even more intense than in Athens, because the scale became so vast. But in Rome, that anxiety quickly fused with an obsession with legal status, with rank.
Cicero might have claimed Rome had one fair set of courts for everyone.
Right. He loved to promote that ideal one law,
Yeah.
equal application, beautiful rhetoric. But the moment Rome really consolidated its power and the wealth started piling up from conquests, the practical reality was that your legal status, your dignitas, became the absolute determinant of how you were treated by the justice system, especially regarding punishment.
The system got good at finding ways around the one law for all idea.
Very good. Particularly in courts that handled serious crimes, extra ordinem meaning outside the regular established procedures, the quesitudes perpetuae, which often had more defined penalties and protections for citizens.
And these extra ordinem courts, they could adjust penalties based on who you were.
Absolutely. We have clear evidence, even before Emperor Hadrian really formalized it, that these courts could, and frequently did, vary the penalties, specifically based on the defendant's social standing. If you were a person of low status, humiliores is the term often used, the more humble people, the urban poor, laborers, maybe small shopkeepers, people without powerful patrons, you are far more likely to receive the harsher, more physically degrading penalties. They often fell into the group subjected to punishments associated with custodia.
What did custodia entail? What kind of punishments are we talking about?
Think hard labor, often for life, in the state mines or quarries, notoriously brutal conditions. Or condemnation to fight as a gladiator, or being thrown to wild beasts in the arena. Severe forms of imprisonment were also used. For someone of low status, a serious conviction often meant a complete loss of physical freedom, public humiliation, and frequently a short, miserable life defined by extreme hardship. The justice system, for them, was often about extracting labor and making a terrifying public example.
But if you were from the elite, a senator, an
Yeah.
equestrian.
A world of difference. For the honnêtes, the more honorable people, these kinds of physical, degrading punishments were almost unthinkable. It was considered a massive scandal, profoundly irregular, for men of high rank to suffer the same fate as common criminals or slaves.
So what happened to them if they were convicted of a serious crime?
For capital offenses, the typical sentence for an elite Roman was deportatio in insulum, exiled to a specific, often remote island. This meant they lost their Roman citizenship and all their property was confiscated by the state. A huge blow, certainly. But their life was spared, and crucially, their physical person wasn't subjected to the whip, the mines, or the arena.
And that really dramatic execution method, being thrown from the Tarpeian Rock.
That was traditionally reserved for traitors, public enemies, or sometimes slave criminals. It was intensely symbolic and public. When it was occasionally applied to a high-status Roman, it was precisely because it was such a shocking deviation from the norm. It was a powerful political statement, signaling utter disgrace and removal from the protected elite status.
So the state was actively managing the optics, ensuring punishment didn't visually degrade the ruling class, to maintain the hierarchy.
It was all about preserving social order and dignitas, that inherent worth and status of the elite. If senators were seen being flogged or working in chains alongside commoners, the entire social structure, which depended on visible hierarchy, could crumble. The law became a tool for reinforcing rank, even in punishment.
And underlying all of this Roman status consciousness was, of course, the absolute bedrock distinction between free and enslaved. The law here seems utterly unambiguous and designed to enforce servitude through harshness.
Absolutely. Roman law explicitly defines slavery as a condition that required harsh treatment and corporal punishment, the use of whips, goads, chains. It was all legally sanctioned. The rationale was that this was necessary to make slaves recognize their condition, to break their will, and ensure they acted like slaves.
Did anyone question this?
Some philosophers did. People like Seneca, or even earlier writers like Xenophon in a Greek context, warned that excessive cruelty was actually counterproductive, that it didn't make slaves obedient, it just made their souls worse, fostered resentment, maybe even made them more likely to rebel or run away. But despite those philosophical qualms, the legal framework itself consistently endorsed severity as necessary to maintain the institution of slavery, which was economically fundamental to Rome.
And even when a slave gained freedom, became a freedman or freedwoman, the state didn't just let go, did it? It kept tight control over their legal status, especially if they had any kind of criminal past as a slave. Freedom wasn't always full freedom.
That's a critical point. Freedom came in degrees, legally speaking. The Lex Sentia, a law passed under Augustus, is a prime example. It specifically dealt with slaves who were manumitted, freed, but who had committed crimes or been severely punished while enslaved.
Okay, what happened to them?
They were confined to a specific inferior legal status. They were put in numero deditiorum in the category of surrendered peoples.
Surrendered peoples, what did that mean in practice?
It meant they were legally regarded almost like the lowest category of defeated foreigners, people who had surrendered unconditionally to Rome, whose own native laws and citizenship were completely extinguished. For these freedmen, it meant they could never attain Roman citizenship no matter what. They were barred forever.
That's harsh.
And perhaps even more devastatingly, they had no testamenti factio, no legal right to make a will.
They couldn't pass on property.
They couldn't legally bequeath anything they might accumulate through their hard work after being freed. Their lineage, in a legal and economic sense, was effectively cut off. This shows the state's determination to maintain absolute, even perpetual control over the boundaries of citizenship and legal personhood. Even escaping slavery didn't guarantee entry into the full rights enjoyed by other free people, especially if your past was deemed criminal. It kept freedmen in a subordinate position.
We've covered political banishment, financial obligations, differential justice based on status. But perhaps the ultimate way the Roman elite tried to control wealth wasn't even during life, but after death. That brings us to legislating legacy.
Yes, the Romans developed incredibly sophisticated legal tools to allow the wealthy to exert control over their property long after they were gone. This reveals this deep, almost desperate desire to ensure the stability and continuity of family wealth and status across generations.
And the main mechanism for this was the fideikommissum.
Exactly, the fideikommissum. It translates roughly as a matter entrusted to good faith. It was essentially a trust, or more accurately, a request made in a will by the testator, the person making the will, to their heir. This request would instruct the heir on how to manage or dispose of certain property, often for the benefit of someone else, maybe someone who couldn't legally inherit directly.
And a common use was trying to stop heirs from selling off key family assets.
Oh, absolutely. Testators were often obsessed with this. They wanted to prevent the dispersal of the family patrimony, especially things like the ancestral estate, the big suburban villa, or the grand townhouse that symbolized the family's standing.
We actually have examples of wills where they try to explicitly forbid this.
We do. You see clauses where a testator, let's call him Lucius Titius, as the jurists often did, explicitly charges his heir in no way to alienate his suburban estate or house. The intention was crystal clear. Keep this property in the family, pass it down through multiple generations. It was a way of trying to legislate family prominence, a bid for a kind of immortality through property.
But Roman law, being the complex system it was, didn't just allow unlimited control from beyond the grave, did it? There were pushbacks, limitations.
That's where the real genius, and perhaps the pragmatism of Roman jurisprudence shines through. The jurists, guys like Scaevola, recognized that allowing the dead unlimited power to tie up property forever could seriously stifle the economic life of the living. It could take valuable assets out of circulation indefinitely.
So they found ways to limit these perpetual restrictions.
Right. Scaevola, for instance, made a crucial ruling. He said that if the testator laid down a condition of non-alienation, don't sell the villa, but failed to clearly explain why, or, more importantly, who would specifically benefit if the property wasn't sold, like keep it for my grandchildren, or so my freedmen can live there.
If it was just a bald command, don't sell.
Then the rule was deemed a nudum preceptum, a bare precept.
A bare precept, and that meant...
It meant it had no binding legal effect. It was considered just an instruction, maybe an expression of the testator's wish, but not legally enforceable. The heir could, in effect, ignore it and sell the property if they wanted to.
Why? What was the reasoning?
The principle was that a will couldn't just arbitrarily lay down a law of this kind for property in perpetuity, removing it from commerce without a clearly defined ongoing benefit or purpose recognized by law. It protected the living economy and the rights of the current owner against the potentially unreasonable or vague demands of the dead hand of the past.
That's fascinating. So the law respected the testator's wishes, but only up to a point, requiring clarity and purpose. Did this resistance to absolute posthumous control show up in other areas, too?
Yes, particularly concerning things the law considered sacred or perhaps beyond monetary valuation, things that couldn't be simply ordered or transferred like property.
Such as?
Well, take parental power, patria potestas. This was the immense legal authority a Roman father held over his children, potentially for their entire lives. A testator might put a clause in their will requesting or even ordering their heir to emancipate their own children, the heir's children, the testator's grandchildren, perhaps.
Asking the heir to free his kids from his own legal control.
Exactly. But the jurist ruled that the heir was not legally compelled by the will to do so, because patria potestas was deemed to be something beyond valuation. It wasn't considered a mere asset or a property right that could be subject to a command in a will or have a monetary value placed upon it for the purposes of fulfilling a trust. The law essentially protected the autonomy and the unique legal status of the living father's authority over his children against the demands of the deceased grandfather.
So even the desire to control your own lineage, to ensure the freedom of your grandchildren, could be overridden by the legal sanctity of the living parent's rights.
Precisely. And this pragmatism extended to physical assets, too. You couldn't, for instance, leave a house as a legacy or a fideicommisum if it was already falling down or legally condemned for demolition.
You couldn't burden your heir with a collapsing building.
Basically, yes.
Right.
The law wouldn't enforce a bequest that was impossible or impose an unreasonable burden related to a valueless or dangerous asset. It shows this underlying Roman legal common sense, constantly balancing the elite's desire for lasting legacy and control against the practical realities of economics, social structures like the family, and physical decay.
Okay, let's try to pull these threads together. We've covered a lot of ground, from Athenian ostracism to Roman inheritance law.
We have. And hopefully what emerges is that while we didn't, spend much time talking about the price of fancy food at dinner parties, the typical sumptuary law stuff,
Right.
we've really dug into the deeper legal architecture. The fundamental tools these ancient states deployed to try and manage what they saw as the moral risks and the social disruptions caused by huge differences in wealth and status.
And the consistent theme seems to be the state stepping in again and again, whether it was through a dramatic mechanism like ostracism in Athens, or the relentless financial pressure of the liturgies,
Mm.
or the way Roman law formalized different treatment based on status in the criminal courts, or even how it regulated control from beyond the grave through things like the fideicomissum. The state was constantly intervening, trying to force or at least define what was acceptable conduct, especially for the elite.
It really does reveal that perennial tension, doesn't it? The state's deep need for order, stability, respect, that Roman idea of dignitas, constantly bumping up against the individual's desire for freedom, for accumulation, for displaying success. And when traditional virtues, maybe the old ways of behaving, seem to be failing under the pressure of new wealth or changing times,
The law stepped in.
the law stepped in, almost as a substitute for a morality they felt was being lost.
Which leads us, I think, to a really provocative final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. We've seen how these legal systems worked, but think about how they worked in practice. In Athens, particularly, there wasn't a class of professional judges interpreting complex statutes for many of these cases, like homicide or inheritance. It often came down to ordinary citizens on a jury.
Large juries, often swayed by rhetoric.
Exactly. How persuasive could you be on that particular day? And even in Rome, with its sophisticated jurists, the actual application of those status-based punishments we talked about still relied heavily on the magistrate's or judge's interpretation of the defendant's social position and the specific circumstances.
So if a law, as one scholar put it, was really embodied less in abstract rules and more in the day-to-day patterns of interpretation, application, and manipulation of these rules,
Yeah.
then what happens to public morality when those legal definitions of status, of justice, of acceptable luxury are maybe less about objective, timeless equity and more about the shifting, complex, maybe even contradictory beliefs and expectations of whichever group of people happen to be acting as judges, representing the demos or the Roman elite on that particular day?
Is the law really regulating virtue then? Or is it just codifying the prevailing anxieties and perhaps the prejudices of the moment?
It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how much of our own legal system, even today, might just be a reflection of our current social anxieties, dressed up as objective justice.
Something to think about. We'll leave you with that.
Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.
See you next time.